Once you learn pivot tables in Excel, there's no going back. Stuff that took you a long time to do with formulas will literally only take a few seconds with pivot tables. Maybe you've heard of pivot tables and thought that they sounded daunting, or maybe you've stumbled onto them and had difficulty. Well, you've come to the right place. Because in this course we'll give you a simple beginner's guide to pivot tables. What will you learn from this course? What is pivot tables, how to build a pivot table, create value field, create row field, create column fields, create filters, updating a pivot table and more. I'm Jacqueline from Excel School. I've been working with Excel for years and I'm excited to show you one of Excel's greatest features, pivot tables. So let's get started. Just what is a pivot table? A pivot table is an incredibly powerful analysis feature in Excel that lets you summarize a bunch of data in just a few clicks. Basically, they let you go from something like this, which is a massive amount of data, to something like this, where you've got your data and then you've got your pivot table, which summarizes the data, and if you look at this pivot table closely, it looks like it's almost collating the transactions for each of these people. Now this is a fairly simple example of a pivot table. Here's a more complex pivot table, and in this case, the pivot table summarizes by the type of purchase and then it divides it up by who spent what. Your pivot tables don't necessarily have to be this complicated when starting out, but just know that this kind of thing is possible to do, and you might have also heard the term pivot chart. Here's an example of one of those. A pivot chart just visualizes the data. And in this case, it's a bar chart. And the underlying data for that chart is, you guessed it, a pivot table. Once you get the basic fundamentals of pivot tables, pivot charts are pretty easy to use. We are not going to cover pivot charts in this course, but there are a slew of other videos on my other course that can explain how to make them. Once you get the hang of pivot tables, getting insights and answers is really easy, and once you grasp the fundamentals, you'll be the envy in the office. First things first, before you make a pivot table you have to be sure your data is ready. It's kind of like stretching before exercising or tuning a guitar before playing it. It's a step that really shouldn't be skipped, because if you do you might run into some challenges later. First, make sure your columns are named at the top, and this may sound really obvious, but if they have good descriptive names they're going to be easier to work with later. This one here, it looks like it is amount, so we might as well just spell it out and rename it amount. And we also have a blank column here and some blank rows. This can be a challenge for pivot tables because pivot tables really need to know exactly where your data starts and ends without any funny blanks in between. So, I'm going to click this column, right-click delete, and then I'm going to click this row. Hold down the Control key, and then select those blank rows. Right-click delete again. And now we've got a pretty good looking data set that's ready for pivot table here. However, there's one really important thing to do before we go here, and that is we need to make this data into an Excel table. And the way you do that is you just click anywhere within your data, press Ctrl T, and then press Enter. And there, you've got an Excel table. Now, why do we make this table? Well, there are some obvious benefits you can see at first here. You've got some colored rows that make the data easier to read. Looks like we have some filter buttons up here we could use if we wanted to. But the real main reason you use a table is that you make it a really good target for a pivot table. So, let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to click in the data and then press Ctrl N to go to the very bottom here. And then I'm going to move outside a bit here and just show you where the table ends. It ends at row 486 here. And let's say I were to add one more row here for mom. Let's say December 31st, 2018, and mom and groceries. Maybe she spent $50. You notice that it made one more row here upon row 487. It dynamically or automatically updated the table range. The reason why this is so important is that if we make a pivot table based on this table, and we want to refresh it and see it updated with new information, it won't know about this new row unless you make this entire data set here into a table, which we did. And the same thing goes for new columns, so you can add a new column as well. And I'll do that. I'll go Control Home on my keyboard and then I'll just type something here. Maybe I type tax or something like that. It adds that column to the table, and then if I made a pivot table, the pivot table when refreshed would see this new column. So, that's really important. Make that Excel table before you make your pivot table. It seems like every app nowadays has its own jargon or set of terminology, and this is true with tables and pivot tables when it comes to the word field. In fact, there are many types of fields, and we'll go over the basic ones here in this video. In your data, or in this case this table, think of the columns as being fields. So, this here is the date field, this is the buyer field, and so on. Why use the word field instead of column? Because the word field is used a lot in the pivot table menus and dialog boxes. Pivot tables simply don't call these columns, they call them fields. So getting used to calling them fields now will help you a lot later. There are also pivot table fields. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to switch to this tab, and I'm going to show you this little pivot table here. Sum of amount and $69,977. Why make such a small pivot table? Because it illustrates the concept of another term, which is the value field. A value field is a field inside a pivot table, and I like to think of the value field as the initial total or pile you want to divide up, but really what it is a field that calculates something. So in this case it's totaling up the amount field. Now let's switch over to this tab. Now, here's a pivot table that's a little more useful. I've highlighted these cells too just to make them stand out for you. This is the pivot table row field right here. And the row field uses another field from the data as a condition that typically divides up the value field. In this case, the row field is buyer, and it's dividing up sum of amount, the value field. And let's go over here and show you another row field. Here the row field is using the type field from the data and dividing up the value field, sum of amount. Now, you might see this cell here that says row labels. Row labels or row label is just another way to say row field. In fact, a lot of people interchangeably use row label, row field, row labels, row fields. I like to stay consistent and call this the row field, and I'll be doing that a lot throughout the course. So to review, you have your regular old fields and your data, and then in your pivot table fields you've got a row field that breaks down a value field. When you're ready to make sense out of seemingly random data, like these transactions here, then it's time to start building a pivot table. Let's walk you through the process. First, click inside the data. And then, on the Insert tab, click Pivot Table. And this dialog box appears, and it can be a little confusing, so let me explain it here. From this point and upward, the dialog box is all about which data to use in the pivot table. And because we made a table earlier, Excel is automatically highlighting and then selecting that data to use. So that's perfect, I don't need to do anything up here. Down here is all about where you want the pivot table to be positioned. Normally, Excel will just put it on a new worksheet for you, and it will put it on a worksheet to the left of the sheet you're on. But this time, for this video, I want the pivot table to be alongside our data, so I'm going to choose existing worksheet, going to keep it on the one I'm on. And I'm going to then click this cell here to place the pivot table in that location, and you'll see that Excel adds that cell address for me. I don't have to type that out. And then I'll go ahead and click OK. Great, I've got an empty pivot table here. I've got the pivot table fields list over here open, and now I'm ready to start adding fields and going to town on this pivot table. Sometimes people put in a blank pivot table like this and they think, well, now what? Well, let me show you the details of how to get going here. The first step you have to do is sort of imagine or envision the pile of information you want to divide up. And if I look at the data here, there's lots of things that could pile up. But the most obvious field I want to pile up is the amount field, cause it has a bunch of money. So what do we do now? We make a value field out of this amount field. And the way we do that is we go on over here to the pivot table fields list. Now if this fields list isn't open for you yet, then go ahead and right-click this area and choose Show Field List. Mine's already open, so mine says Hide. So you may need to do that if you don't see this fields list open over here. So to make that value field out of the amount field, I'm going to take this amount field and drag it down to values. Great! Here's a little pivot table here, and it has one thing of value field, that initial pile, to divide up. Now if you're ever stumped and you're not sure which field to turn into a value field, then look for any kind of amount or quantity like dollars, or if you have a column for duration, number of minutes, number of hours, that works too. If you don't have a field that has a quantity in it, then I'll show you what happens. I'm going to go ahead and remove this value field by clicking the arrow on the field, then choosing Remove Field. And I'll just add this type field to the values field instead. What happens here is because I added the type field, type has a bunch of text values. It doesn't have quantities or numbers. So Excel does its best, and instead of adding this stuff up, it counts the number of rows in the field. This is sometimes helpful actually if you need to know how many purchases were made, just the count of them, or how many orders were sold on a sales team, for example. Let's remove this field. I'm going to go back down here, and I could click this arrow and choose Remove Field like I did before, but I'm going to instead just drag it off to the side until it changes to an X, and then I'm going to let go. And there we have that empty pivot table. That's fine. We'll go ahead and bring this amount field down to values to bring back that sum of amount value field. And one more thing I'd like to do here. Since this is money currency, I want to change the formatting to match this one. By default it doesn't do that. You just have to do one extra step. So I'm going to click the arrow, go to Value Field Settings, Number Format, and then Currency. And then I'll just knock down the decimal places to 0. Click OK, OK again. And now we have a nicely formatted value field for currency. So we made a value field, and really in my opinion, it's the best field to add to the pivot table first because it gives you that initial pile or total of stuff that you can later divide up with the other fields. Okay, let's make this little pivot table here more interesting and start adding more fields to it. Specifically, we want to add some conditions that break up this value field. So we're going to go up here to our field list, and we're going to drag the buyer field down to rows. There, the pivot table now has this row field that divides up the value field. That's great. And let's just take a moment and explain this user interface, this area down here at the bottom of the pivot table fields list. Sometimes you'll open this fields list up and you might think, okay, where do I put fields exactly? Well, just remember that since rows is on the left here and values is on the right here, your row fields will be on the left here and your value field will be on the right. So just a little reminder in case you're ever stumped when you open up that pivot table fields list. Now let's go further, and I'm actually going to add a second row field to this rows area, and I'm going to drag it after the buyer field so you see that little highlight after the buyer field, and I'll let go, and there we can see that the pivot table now has two row fields, buyer and type. And here's the buyer row field dividing up the value field, and here's the type field dividing up the value field, and it does that throughout the data set. Now let's do something a little different here. I'm going to move the type field above buyer, and then I can switch that order around, and you can see okay. The type is now the primary row field, and the buyer is the secondary one, the one under type. So just another perspective on the data. Pivot tables are very flexible. You can really move fields around in this area to get the view of the data that you want. You can also add a date field, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to remove these fields, and I'm going to go ahead and drag date down to rows. And when I do that, it actually automatically adds two fields for me. One is months and one is date. And it'll do this if you have certain versions of Excel. It'll automatically give you certain fields down here that are helpful. So in this case, it's giving me a nice helpful report of how much was spent each month. And then if I clicked and expanded it, it'll show me the actual days in which money was spent. I actually don't think I need the date at all. I think that's a little too much information for this view, so I'll just drag date out, and now I just have months, and months is dividing up the amount. So the important thing to remember here is that your row fields can be positioned above or below each other like we did before. So I'll do it one more time. I'm going to go ahead and put buyer down here, and I'm going to put it under months, and then I can see in each month how much was spent by each person. You can see how these multiple row fields can help you drill down and see very important details on your data. Pivot tables can give you very specific insights on your data, and one way to do that is with column fields. In this pivot table, you can see I have a row field for months, and then I have the value field for sum of amount. Now I'm going to add a column field by dragging the type field down to columns. And then I'll scroll over to the right a little bit so you can see the whole thing. Now you can see we have that row field of months, and we have column fields that are dividing up that sum of amount field. In this case, it works pretty good. I have got the months here, and then inside each month I can see how much was spent on each category of purchase. You can also add secondary column fields like we did with secondary row field. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drag the buyer under the type field here in the columns area. And I'm going to have to really scroll this time to see everything. And you'll see that what happens is that each month of transactions are separated by type, and then under type by the buyer. Now, because column fields stretch the pivot table out in a very wide fashion, a lot of people don't really like using column fields because it's so hard to scroll back and forth. But they are good when you can keep that scrolling to a minimum. And they're especially good when you need to represent time going from left to right. So like January to December from left to right. And we can do that. We'll just go ahead and we will drag these fields over here and then move the time element, the months field, over to columns. And now we can see with a little less scrolling, or a lot less scrolling, actually, our time span going from January to December. And then we can see the breakdown of types of purchases and buyer more easily. This is especially helpful if you're viewing this workbook on a small screen device, maybe like a laptop, and you don't have a lot of screen space to scroll horizontally. Okay, when you've got row fields and column fields all positioned nicely, you might want to throw another field into the mix that adds yet another condition to the pivot table, and that's a filter. When you add a filter to a pivot table, you can choose something like January, and the whole pivot table will update and only show you January's transactions. Or you could choose something like February and only see February's transactions. So let's do that. I'm going to go over here to months, and I'm going to drag that down to filters. Now if you don't have months, then just drag date down to the filters area, and doing that will likely give you both date and months. And if that's the case, just remove date and only keep months down here in filters. But what that does is it adds this filter arrow up here, and now you can choose just January and update the pivot table with those transactions, or February. Or you could select multiple items if you wanted to and choose many months. Filters are pretty amazing, and there are other kinds of filters. This is a very basic one, but there are other kinds, and I'm going to show you those. I'm going to remove this basic one here, and I'm going to go up here to the Analyze tab and insert a slicer. A slicer is a kind of filter. I'm going to choose the months field for the slicer, and you can see that this slicer panel of buttons appears, and this is just a filter, so I can select January and see only January's amounts, or February and see only February's amounts. I'm going to select that and then delete it to get rid of it for now. Another kind of filter is also available up here on the Analyze tab, and that is the timeline. So I'm going to insert a timeline filter for date. list, and this gives me this nice timeline to work with that I can actually interact with. So, for example, I can just see if I want January 2018's transactions, or I can go further to February or even further up to July. So you get the idea. That is a nice interactive timeline control, if you will, over the pivot table. Filters, gosh, they're probably one of the best things to add to a pivot table, and when you do that, because they're so interactive, other people can open up your file and interact with the data and get to the answers they need. It's quite an accomplishment once you get your first pivot table set up with row fields, columns, and filters. But one important thing to know about is how to update a pivot table. For example, let's say we make a correction to the data here, and maybe mom spent $1,200 on groceries in January, here, on the 2nd of January. Well, you'll notice that her amount didn't update here right away. So, to update the pivot table, right-click it and choose Refresh. And there you'll see that $1,200 appear here for mom. Well, you might think, why didn't this happen automatically when you make a pivot table? It takes a snapshot of this data and then creates a report or a separate copy of the data in a different view. So, if something changes at the source, it doesn't really know about that change quite yet, so you have to update it by right-clicking and choosing Refresh. Now, you might think this is an unnecessary step, but it's just the nature of pivot tables. Pivot tables are snapshots or copies of the data in a different view. Excel experts are quite aware of this, and they call that snapshot the pivot table cache. And cache, meaning it's just stuff that's stored in a hidden place. So, to refresh that cache, you right-click and hit Refresh. Or, you can use the shortcut key, which is Alt plus F5. So I showed you the basics of pivot tables. You saw how important it was to start with clean data and how to make a table on that data. Then I showed you how to make a pivot table based on that table. I also showed you some cool things like the importance of the value field, row fields, column fields, and filters. But where do you go from here? Well, it just so happens that there's a lot more to learn with pivot tables. And if you're in Excel, you can use the help. I'm going to press the F1 key and bring up the help pane. Then I'm going to type something in here. Maybe I type pivot chart, and there you have several articles that can walk you through pivot charts, pivot tables, and so on. And if you're thinking, well, you only showed me how to turn a simple table into a pivot table. How do I take 5 tables and put those into one? Continue your pivot table journey by watching my Power Pivot Excel course. Thank you for your time in this course. I hope you enjoyed this very short course on learning pivot tables in Excel. If you're looking for some more to learn, I highly recommend watching my other Excel courses. Feel free to share anything you come up with and use this project as a community resource while going through the course and a place to show off your work at the end.